I moved into the small, nondescript house on Maple Street at the start of summer. The place was older, with creaky floorboards and a yard that needed serious attention, but it had a charm I couldn't ignore. The neighborhood seemed quiet, filled with families and retirees who waved from their porches when I passed by. It felt like a good place to start fresh after my divorce, a place where I could finally have some peace. The first week passed without much incident. I spent my days unpacking, mowing the overgrown grass, and making the place feel like home. It was on the second week that I met Joe, the neighbor who lived directly across the street. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with deep-set eyes and a smile that looked strained, as if he had practiced it in the mirror and never quite perfected it. He introduced himself while I was trimming the hedges, said he had been in the neighborhood for over 30 years, told me that he liked to keep an eye on things, make sure everyone was safe. At first, I appreciated his concern. It was nice to know someone had their eye out for any trouble. But Joe's definition of safe became unsettlingly clear as the weeks went by. He would stand by his window, half hidden by a lace curtain, watching the street for hours. He was always there when I came home from work, a shadow behind the glass. Sometimes, late at night when I took out the trash, I'd catch him sitting on his front porch, just staring. His eyes would follow me, unblinking, as I walked back up my driveway. One evening, I was out front fixing the gutter when he approached. His steps were quiet, almost as if he glided over the pavement. He asked how I was settling in and if I'd noticed anything strange. I paused, unsure of what he meant, and shook my head. He nodded slowly, his expression serious, and muttered that this street had seen its fair share of problems. Then he leaned in and said he'd caught someone prowling around my side yard the night before. My pulse quickened, and I glanced at the narrow strip of grass between my house and the neighbors. It was hard to see anything at night. I asked if he got a good look at them, and he shook his head, saying they slipped away before he could confront them. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me tense, every creak of the old house setting my nerves on edge. The next morning, I checked the yard for any signs of an intruder but found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Joe had planted a seed of doubt that rooted itself deep. The weeks that followed were filled with subtle oddities. I'd come home to find my gate open or my garden hose uncoiled and stretched across the lawn. My mail would be in strange disarray, as if someone had rifled through it. Every time something happened, I'd look across the street and see Joe watching. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely concerned or enjoying the chaos. One Saturday, I decided enough was enough. I approached his house, determined to have a conversation and set some boundaries. I knocked on the door and waited, hearing the muffled sound of a TV inside. After a moment, the door opened and Joe stood there, his smile that same practiced curve. I told him that I appreciated him looking out for me, but that I wanted to handle my own security. His eyes narrowed and he nodded, stepping back into the shadow of his hallway. As I turned to leave, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. A voice inside whispered that I'd made a mistake. I ignored it and went home, locking the doors and drawing the curtains. That night, as the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, I woke to a noise. A soft, metallic scraping. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The noise came again from outside the window. I reached for my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address to the operator. The minutes stretched like hours until I saw the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car. The officers found nothing, no footprints, no signs of tampering, just me standing in my pajamas trying to explain the sound that had shattered my sleep. As they drove off, I saw Joe on his porch, arms crossed, a knowing look on his face. He didn't say anything, just watched as I retreated back inside. The next day, I decided to install security cameras around the house. I worked late into the evening, ensuring every angle was covered. The sense of control gave me some comfort, but Joe's stare never wavered. That night, I checked the footage obsessively, replaying each moment to make sure I hadn't missed anything. It wasn't until a few nights later that the footage revealed what I'd been dreading. In the grainy, black and white glow of the night vision, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my yard, hidden partially by the hedges. They moved slowly, cautiously, until they were just a few feet from my window. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the outline of Joe's familiar frame. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, looking up at the window before backing away into the dark. The realization hit me like ice water. The things that had been happening weren't the work of a faceless prowler. Joe had been orchestrating the fear, feeding my paranoia, enjoying the way I spiraled with each passing day. I didn't confront him. Instead, I went straight to the police with the footage. They took it seriously, enough to pay Joe a visit. I watched from my window as they knocked on his door and led him out to the squad car, his face blank, eyes scanning my house one last time. The street feels different now, quieter in a way that no longer brings peace. I moved away shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that Joe's eyes were still on me, somewhere out there, behind another lace curtain. The duplex next door had always been a mystery. It was old, with cracked siding and a sagging porch that hadn't seen a repair crew in years. While my side was well kept and filled with life, the other half looked like it belonged in an old black and white photograph, a reminder of the past that refused to move on. But what made it truly strange were the people who moved in and out of it like whispers in the wind, always leaving just as quietly as they came. It wasn't until the Langley family moved in that things changed. They were different from the others. They stayed longer, settled in, made the place feel lived in, even if only barely. The father, Richard, was tall and quiet, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of something he'd rather not share. His wife, Carla, was friendly enough, always offering a smile when she saw me, but never stopping for more than a hello. The daughter, Lily, was the odd one, pale, with hair the color of crow feathers and eyes so dark they seemed bottomless. She watched the world around her with an intensity that made me shiver. For weeks, the Langleys went about their lives with a quiet routine, as if they were careful not to draw too much attention. I would hear faint piano music drifting through the thin walls, the notes delicate, hesitant, and almost haunting. But then, at night, there was something else. A noise, subtle but unmistakable, the sound of furniture scraping across the floor, footsteps moving too quickly, and sometimes a stifled sob. One evening, I was sitting in my living room when I heard a crash so loud it rattled my windows. Teddy, my chocolate lab, barked, ears pricked as he paced nervously. I stood and pressed my ear to the shared wall. There was a muffled thud, a shuffle of hurried feet, and then silence. I told myself it was none of my business. People have their problems, who was I to intrude? But as the days passed, the sounds only grew stranger. Whispers at odd hours, as if there were more than 3 voices on the other side. The piano, which had once played lullabies, now produced broken, discordant notes that clawed at my nerves. One night, as I returned home from a late shift, I noticed a light flickering in the Langleys' upstairs window. The glow was faint, a candle maybe, swaying as if someone were holding it, and behind it, Lily stood, staring out at the street, her eyes reflecting the flame. It felt like she was looking straight at me, even though I knew she couldn't see through the darkness. I waved awkwardly, but she didn't move, didn't blink. The flame wavered again, and the shadow of a hand reached from the dark behind her, yanking the candle away. The window plunged into darkness. I rushed inside, heart pounding, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But Teddy wouldn't calm down. He paced, growled low at the door, and barked sharply at the empty corners of the room. The next morning I saw Carla in her yard, tending to a row of struggling flowers. I tried to approach her casually, but before I could say a word, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She asked if I'd heard anything strange the night before. I hesitated, then nodded. She looked away, whispered that it was nothing, and returned to her task with trembling hands. By evening, the noise was worse. Voices rose and fell in angry bursts. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable pleading, demanding, terrified. The urge to intervene grew stronger, and I found myself at their front door, hand raised to knock. But before I could, the door opened just a crack, and Richard's face appeared, pale and drawn. He asked what I wanted. I stuttered that I was checking in, that I'd heard noise, that I was worried. His eyes darted past me to the street, then back. He said everything was fine, just some late-night stress, and closed the door without another word. The next day, the Langleys were gone. Their side of the duplex was quiet, curtains drawn, no sign of life. Weeks passed, and no one returned. A moving truck never came. Mail piled up, yellowed and forgotten. I asked the landlord if he knew anything, but he just shrugged, said they left without notice. Months later, a police car pulled up to the curb, followed by a van marked with the logo of a local newspaper. Officers and reporters swarmed the Langley side, taking pictures, collecting boxes. I stood on my porch, watching the scene unfold, feeling that icy prickle of dread creep up my spine. One of the officers caught my eye, came over and asked if I... He nodded solemnly and said they'd found a room, hidden behind a false wall in the upstairs bedroom. Inside there were journals, notes, and a small, disused piano covered in scratches and burn marks. The officers who had skimmed through the journals looked very pale, like they had seen something traumatic. They asked me a few general questions about the Langleys. It was a lot of basic questions regarding their routine and any other odd things I may have noticed. I answered all of their questions, but I could tell that they were trying to draw something else out of me, some kind of explanation relating to what they discovered in the journals. I subtly tried to press and find out what was written. But when it was clear to them that I didn't know anything about it, they dismissed me and refused to answer any further questions. They never found the Langleys. The officer thanked me for my time and walked back to join his colleagues. As I watched, I thought I heard a soft, familiar piano note echoing from the upstairs window, a single mournful key pressed by an unseen hand. Teddy whimpered, pressing against my leg, eyes locked on the darkened window. I swallowed hard and turned away, willing myself to forget. But that night, when the house was quiet and the world seemed to hold its breath, I swore I heard Lily's voice whisper through the wall, asking if I was still there. I never found out what was written in those journals, but I still think about the Langleys often. They were my neighbors for such a short amount of time, but I don't think I'll ever forget that time. I can only hope that Lily is okay and is out there somewhere living a happy and fulfilling life. When I first moved into the duplex, it felt like a dream come true. The rent was cheap, the location was decent, and the place was cozy enough for me and my dog, Charlie. The only downside was that the other half of the house was occupied by a tenant I hadn't met. The landlord had mentioned that the man living next door kept to himself, and that suited me just fine. I liked my privacy and figured we'd both be happy to ignore each other. The first few weeks were quiet. I settled into my new routine, unpacked boxes, and walked Charlie through the neighborhood each evening. Occasionally I'd hear noises coming from the other side of the wall, muffled shuffling, the sound of furniture being moved, or the faint strain of a television. It was all normal enough. But after a while, the sounds grew stranger. One night, as I was sitting on the couch watching a movie, I heard a rhythmic tapping coming from the shared wall. It was soft at first, like someone was drumming their fingers. I paused the movie and listened. The tapping continued, growing faster, more frantic. I told myself it was probably just a rodent in the wall, some pest trying to find its way out. I turned up the volume and tried to ignore it. The next day I ran into Mrs. Henderson from down the street while walking Charlie. She was the neighborhood busybody, always ready with a story or two. When she asked how I was settling in, I mentioned the noise I'd been hearing from next door. Her face changed, the smile faltering just a bit. She leaned in and told me that the man who lived there, Mr. Dempsey, had been living alone for years. He wasn't exactly social, but he was harmless, she said, always keeping to himself. But then she added that he'd had some trouble in the past, a vague statement that left more questions than answers. That night, the tapping came again. This time it was joined by another sound, a low, throaty hum, like someone was mumbling to themselves. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. The sound stopped abruptly, and I pulled back, a chill crawling up my spine. I told myself to stop overthinking. It was just an old man, probably talking to himself. But the unease clung to me, lingering long after the house fell silent. As the weeks passed, the noises escalated. There were thuds, dragging sounds, and sometimes what I could only describe as the faintest sobbing. I began to feel watched, as if every time I passed by the door that led to the shared hallway, a pair of eyes followed me. Even Charlie sensed it, his ears perking up and a low growl rumbling in his chest when the noises started. One night he barked at the door, his hackles raised, and refused to come when I called him. I shivered as I dragged him back into the living room. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening. I was cooking dinner when I heard a loud crash, so forceful that it rattled the dishes in the cabinet. I turned off the stove and walked cautiously to the shared wall. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing in on me with an almost tangible weight. I waited for a sign, any indication that Mr. Dempsey was all right, but nothing came. I debated for a long minute before stepping outside and knocking on his door. There was no answer, just the creak of the wind and the distant buzz of cicadas. I knocked again, calling out that I wanted to make sure everything was okay. Still nothing. I turned to head back to my side when I heard a whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. It was coming from the other side of his front door. He's watching. The hair on my arm stood up. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing as I locked myself back inside. I checked all the windows, making sure they were secure, and turned every light on in the house. Charlie followed me, tail tucked between his legs. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every shadow that shifted across the floor had me on edge. The next morning I called the landlord and told him what had happened. He said he'd check in on Mr. Dempsey later that day, and I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine. But later that afternoon, a police car pulled up in front of the duplex. 2 officers knocked on Mr. Dempsey's door, and when he didn't answer, they forced it open. I watched from the window, heart thundering in my chest as they stepped inside. Minutes passed before they emerged again, one of them shaking his head as he spoke into his radio. The other glanced at my house and caught my eye for a split second before turning away. The landlord called me shortly after. He said Mr. Dempsey had passed away, likely several weeks ago. The noises, the tapping, the sobbing, it couldn't have been him. He added that the police found signs of someone else having been in the house, though they hadn't found anyone inside. A squatter, maybe, or someone who knew Mr. Dempsey and had come back after he died. He advised me to keep my doors locked and promised that the police would patrol the area more frequently. I thanked him, my voice hollow. That night I sat in my living room with Charlie curled up at my feet, both of us staring at the wall that divided my house from the empty, dark half next door. I listened, every nerve on high alert, waiting for the silence to break. And it did. The tapping came again, faint and rhythmic, right where I'd heard it so many nights before. Charlie lifted his head, ears pricked and eyes wide, and let out a soft growl. His gaze was fixed on the wall, the fur along his spine standing up like needles. I whispered to myself that it had to be something logical, a branch brushing against the siding, or maybe a raccoon trying to make a nest. But logic fell flat against the suffocating tension that pressed down on me. I stood up, legs unsteady, and approached the wall. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to hold me back. The tapping stopped when I reached out, my fingertips hovering just above the surface of the paint. Silence wrapped around me, thick and oppressive, broken only by Charlie's low growls. I pressed my ear against the wall. The cold seeping from it made my skin prickle. For a moment, there was nothing but the dull thump of my heartbeat. Then, just as I was about to pull away, a whisper slipped through the thin barrier between rooms. "Are you listening?" I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was quiet, almost a rasp, and definitely human. There was no denying it now, someone was in there. My mind raced through the possibilities: a squatter, some stranger who'd found their way in and stayed hidden after the police had come and gone. The idea that I had been living next to someone without knowing it sent a shiver down my spine. I fumbled for my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line, stammering out my address and telling them that I could hear someone in the other half of the duplex. They assured me an officer would be dispatched shortly, but those minutes waiting felt like hours. The silence from next door was suffocating, the quiet stretching into a tense, unbearable void. Finally, the blue and red lights of the patrol car cast shifting shadows across my living room. 2 officers stepped out, one of them knocking on my door while the other approached Mr. Dempsey's half of the duplex. I opened the door, my voice shaking as I explained what I had heard. They exchanged a glance before the second officer drew his flashlight and disappeared inside. Moments later, he called out that it was clear. The other officer nodded to me, then followed his partner inside. I stood on the porch with Charlie, who was still growling low in his throat as they moved through the darkened house. The sound of their footsteps echoed, hollow and lonely, as they checked each room. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged again, their expressions unreadable. The first officer said there was no one inside, no signs of forced entry, no indications that anyone had been there since the police had found Mr. Dempsey's body. He asked if I'd seen anyone enter or leave the house in the days after the discovery. I shook my head, unable to find the words to explain the tapping, the voice, the feeling of being watched. One of the officers nodded sympathetically and handed me a card, telling me to call if I heard anything else. They promised to keep an eye on the property, then drove off into the night, leaving me alone with the empty, silent house next door. I locked the door behind me, double-checking each window before I settled back onto the couch. Charlie lay at my feet, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old house. The silence returned, pressing in on me like a weight. For a moment, I dared to hope that whatever it was, it had finally passed. But as the clock struck midnight, a faint, rhythmic tapping began again, this time softer, more insistent. My heart sank as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the wall this time. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. Charlie growled, the hair along his back bristling as he stared at the dark hallway. My pulse raced, and I gripped my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The tapping stopped, replaced by a whisper that drifted down the hall like a breath of wind. "I know you're there." I stayed frozen on the couch, the whisper hanging in the air like smoke. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that stress and sleepless nights had warped my senses. But Charlie's low growl told me otherwise. He was still staring at the hallway, eyes locked on something I couldn't see. Summoning the last of my courage, I pushed myself to my feet. Every step toward the hallway felt like moving through quicksand. The tapping resumed, sharp and deliberate, almost mocking. It was coming from just outside my bedroom door, a rhythmic knock that echoed in my chest. I reached out to turn on the hallway light, my fingers brushing the switch just as the tapping stopped. The sudden silence felt like a taunt, as if whatever was on the other side of the door was waiting for me to make the next move. I swallowed hard and inched forward, my pulse drumming so loudly in my ears that I barely heard Charlie bark behind me. The moment my fingers touched the doorknob, a burst of movement exploded from the other side. The door shuddered under the impact, and I staggered back, heart leaping into my throat. The handle twisted, and the door creaked open a fraction, just wide enough for a sliver of darkness to spill into the hallway. My phone buzzed in my hand, making me jump. The screen lit up with an incoming call, the number blocked. I hesitated, glancing between the phone and the cracked door, then answered it with a trembling hello. A voice, deep and distorted, spoke. It said my name slowly, drawing out each syllable like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. My blood turned to ice as it continued, telling me that I had seen too much, that I should have ignored the tapping, ignored the whispers, ignored everything. It said there were places meant to stay forgotten, secrets better left buried. The line went dead, and I stood there, staring at the phone, my mind racing. I felt a shift in the air, a breeze that shouldn't have been there, and realized the bedroom door was now fully open. Darkness yawned before me, impossibly deep, as if the room had been swallowed whole. Charlie barked again, snapping me out of my paralysis. I turned and bolted down the hall, grabbing my keys and throwing open the front door. We raced outside into the night, the cold air biting at my skin, and didn't stop until we were across the street, the empty duplex staring back at us like a hollow-eyed specter. From the safety of the neighbor's driveway, I watched as a shadow moved across the window of my bedroom, lingering for a moment before slipping out of sight. I shivered, every nerve in my body screaming that I had to get away. Far away. The police came again, took my statement, and searched both halves of the duplex. They found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no sign of life, no sign of whatever had whispered my name. The official report said there was no evidence of an intruder, but I knew better. So did Charlie, who stayed by my side, alert and wary, long after the officers left. I packed up and moved out the next day, leaving behind the echoes of tapping and the hollow, whispering voice. The duplex remained empty, a quiet shell that seemed to watch me as I drove away for the last time. I never spoke of it again, but sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I hear that familiar, deliberate tapping, and I know, somewhere in the dark, someone is listening too.